Chapter 4. Choy slowly fought his way back to consciousness, his first thought of Boone. He had always loved the way she looked after working out, her face covered in a fine sheen of sweat, her thin soaked t-shirt stretched almost invisible by her muscles and chest. Her small brown nipples always poked through her shirt like they were calling for attention, and he tried to give them as much as she would let him. But most of all he loved the way she smelled after exercising. An earthy, wet clay sort of smell that turned him on like nothing else ever could. He would run his face across her sweaty arms or back or shoulders, burying himself against her, never wanting to let go. Choy had been lucky that Boone liked his love of her smell. They had made love after almost every workout. Boone called it her reward. But Choy knew secretly it was much more his reward. In his mind he could see her face, her small nose, her bright eyes, as if they were in front of him now. She smiled at him, called to him, and then the alien jaws cut through her face, smashing her smile, cutting off her call. The alien's jaws drooled her blood, leering at him, laughing at his inability to help her. He fought to go to her, but something held him back. The alien's jaws sliced through her face, and her blood was everywhere. She was dead. Overwhelming sadness caught him like a hard blow to the stomach. Boone was dead. He had watched her die, unable to move fast enough to save her. He wanted to die too, join her wherever she was now. He moaned and tried to roll over, but something held him like a heavy wet blanket. He could barely feel his legs and arms, and his head felt thick, like he had a bad hangover. He struggled to remember where he was, what he had been doing that would cause this, but the nightmare of her face exploding in front of him kept filling his vision, and he couldn't shake it. "End of the line, dog boy," a voice said from above. Choy's mind cleared a little, and the smell of rotten eggs filled his senses like a hammer pounding his thick skull. Oh, Jesus Christ Almighty! He was in the alien sector. What the hell was going on? He fought to open his eyes to blurry, faint light. Was Boone really dead? Had that all been a bad dream? Had he gotten hurt on the last mission instead? "Nice nap," the voice said, and a rough hand pulled Choy into a sitting position with his back to the wall. Choy shook his head carefully and took a few deep breaths of the humid, rancid air. He knew that voice. "Berggren? Nice to have you back with us," Berggren said. He was standing over Choy with a pistol in one hand. "That was quite a job you did on my men." Choy's hands quickly fought to pull some of the remaining taser webs from his legs and body. He blinked and his gaze finally focused on Berggren. Then he glanced around. They were in the alien section all right, just inside the west airlock. Slime formations covered some of the walls, and the smell was so thick that the air seemed to have texture to it. It looked as if they were alone. None of the professor's other men were in sight, at least. "Berggren," Choy said, pulling off more webs and flexing his legs. "You're gonna die." Berggren laughed, but his pistol never wavered. "I don't think so. You Marines have just pushed the professor a little too far. Someone's gotta slap you down." "Yeah, and you're the elected, right?" Choy almost had the webs off his legs and was struggling to stand. He would show this two-bit jerk that no one got away with shooting him with a taser like he was some damn bug. Berggren laughed again. "Yeah, lucky me. I get to help you Marines know your place in the Professor's larger plan. Only, I'm afraid, it's just a little too late for you to learn much from the lesson." Berggren's gun moved slightly lower, and the sound of a shot echoed through the stone tunnels and caverns. For just a moment, Choy thought Berggren had missed him. He started to move, but then, as if in slow motion, his own blood splattered his face, and the pain from his leg almost blacked him out. He twisted around and grabbed his leg, focusing on releasing the pain like he and Boone had learned in basic. Don't think about the pain, just react. Don't think about the pain, just react. He could almost hear Boone's voice repeating that with him over and over. Don't think, react. You bastard! Choy pulled his good leg underneath him and pushed off, lunging for Berggren. Berggren quickly stepped back a few steps, and the lunge fell short, leaving Choy to fall twisting on the hard floor, in even more pain than before as his wounded leg banged the hard surface. "You were a dead mother the minute you smeared that damned bug," Berggren said, standing just out of Choy's reach. "The Professor doesn't like his pets being hurt." Choy fought the blackness back. "Don't think about the pain, just react. Don't think about the pain, just react." Quickly, he dragged himself back over to the stone wall and forced himself to stand. For a moment, the dizziness and the pain held him down, but he fought through it and finally gained his feet. Berggren was walking quickly towards the airlock to the human quarters. "Wait!" Choy shouted, glancing around the damp, smelly corridor. For the first time, it dawned on him what Berggren was doing. Choy started to jump one-legged for the airlock, but the drugs from the taser and the shock of his wound made him too weak. He fell face first on the floor, his right hand searching for the small knife in the boot holster on his injured leg. It was slick, covered in his own blood. He palmed it and again shouted for Berggren to wait. Berggren opened the airlock and stood just inside the alien section, framed by the light from the corridor beyond. Choy got a burst of fresh air, but it was smothered by the stench and humid thickness of the alien caverns and that hated smell of rotten eggs. With his hand still on the airlock button, Berggren glanced back at Choy. "I'd love to make this clean for you, but it's not worth my life. Crossing the Professor is never a wise move. But I suppose you understand that now, right?" Choy pulled himself hand over hand towards the airlock, dragging his useless leg behind him, ignoring the pain and the weakness. "Just react. Just react," he repeated over and over. "Don't think, just react." Panic blurred his thoughts, but his training won out, and he kept moving, pushing to escape. Pushing to get closer to that door. Berggren watched for a moment, then shrugged, like it didn't make any difference. "I've got to hand it to you, Choy. You are one tough mother. Maybe you'll be lucky." He started to step through the door. "Maybe you'll bleed to death before implantation." Without thinking or even aiming, Choy swung up into a sitting position and then sent the knife in a practiced underhand flick towards Berggren. The thick sound of the blade burying itself in Berggren's chest filled Choy's ears with pleasure. Berggren, one hand on the knife, a total look of shock and dismay on his face, staggered against the doorframe. Choy crawled towards the open door as fast as he could. Berggren looked down at the knife, then back at Choy as his eyes glazed over and he toppled into the alien sector. Behind him, the airlock slid closed with a resounding clang that reverberated down the dark corridors. "No!" Choy shouted. But his words only echoed through the hot, dark corridors. He was alone where no man dared to be alone. Behind him, he heard a rustling noise that quickly grew to fill the small stone cavern. "Don't think. Ignore the pain. Just react." He pushed Berggren's body aside and stretched up for the button on the airlock, pounding it hard, over and over again. Nothing. It was closed, and it wasn't going to open. He could tell. He turned, pushed himself up with his arms, got his good leg beneath his butt, and stood. Insistently, he pushed the open button, but the door wasn't moving. He tried to yank it open with brute strength, but it didn't even budge. He was trapped. He almost toppled over as he reached down and pulled his knife out of Berggren's chest, wiping the blood on Berggren's shirt. "At least you went with me," he said. He stood and leaned lightly against the airlock door. "Boone," he said intently to the air around him. "I ain't going down without a fight. You're going to be proud of me." He pulled another knife out of his other boot and stood facing the darkness. There was a rustling in the shadows, and the smell grew stronger. Choy shouted into the dark caverns. "Come and get me, you bitch!" And almost before he had time to blink, she did. The professor nodded and turned from the wall of monitors to face Larson. "Too bad about your man Berggren, but this only proves he was careless and soft. Have your men retrieve his body. I can use it." Larson nodded, still staring at the screen and the body of his second-in-command. "Also," Kleist said, "you can expect trouble from Sergeant Green." Larson forced himself to look at the professor. "Not if he doesn't find out." "Oh, he'll know," the professor said. "And please make sure that he does. Do you understand?" Larson just nodded, glancing back to the picture of Berggren's body. The alien had killed the struggling Choy by breaking his back like a dry stick. Blood rolled out of Choy's mouth as the alien pulled him out of range of the camera and towards the center of the hive. "Any movement from our shuttle pilot and her boyfriend?" "She was asleep the last time I checked," Larson said. "I have someone monitoring her round the clock. Hank's on duty. They have a date for dinner after he gets off." The professor turned back to face the screen and sat unmoving, thinking. Every detail seemed to be in place. It would be another 30 hours before he knew if his latest experiment was going to succeed. So many failures, so many close calls. But he had a feeling this would be the one, and 30 hours from now, he would know. "It seems," the professor said, "that I have a little time to kill. Where is our Mr. Cray?" Larson leaned over the edge of the desk and punched up a view in the center screen, then nodded towards it. "In his quarters, just sitting on his bed. From what I can tell, he hasn't moved in 2 hours. That guy's a strange bird." The professor studied the solid frame of his guest. For being one of the best spies, he certainly didn't look much like one, whatever a spy was supposed to look like. Maybe it would be interesting to bait the guy a little, give him just a little rope. See how good he really was. Have Grace bring our guest to the labs. I might as well show him around. The professor stood and took his lab coat off its hook beside the door. He put the coat on and was about to leave when a soft bell chimed. Larson punched a key on the control board on the professor's desk and listened for a moment, then clicked it off and looked up at the professor. Just our shuttle pilot. She's awake and headed for the lounge. The professor nodded. I'm not sure exactly why I don't like that woman, but I just don't. I can sense the trouble she's going to bring. I'll watch her, Larson said. Of that I have no doubt, the professor said. As the door clicked closed behind Kleist, Larson dropped into the professor's big padded chair. With a quick series of keystrokes, he cleared the images of Berggren from the center screens. Then, on 3 screens and from 3 different angles, he followed Joyce Palmer into the main lounge. He loved to watch her. In just the last day, he knew most of her habits, where the scar on her right leg was, and what she did in the bathroom when she brushed her teeth. Someday, he might even catch her alone, and if the professor gave him permission, she'd find out that she had a really true admirer. The cool, clear taste of mountain crystal cut the fog from Joyce's mind, and she nodded to the bartender, indicating her drink. Nice, Jonathan. Real nice. He smiled back at her, patted the bar lightly twice, and moved off to help the waitress at the end of the counter. Joyce took another sip, letting the cold, clear liquid fill her mouth, as she settled into the high-backed bar stool. Being with Hank had been wonderful, almost better than it should have been, but she couldn't, or maybe it was shouldn't, let herself care too much for him. She would be leaving within the week, maybe within the day, to go back to Earth and her children, never to see him again. Getting too attached would be just plain stupid. Good sex. That was all it could be. Ever. Of course, she didn't want to believe that deep down. There was something between her and Hank that she hadn't felt in years, and it felt good. Really good. She took another sip of the mountain crystal and tried to force her thoughts from Hank. She glanced around the bar, noting that there were only a dozen people in the room, mostly sitting together in one large corner, laughing and talking. This place was officially called the East Lounge, but many called it the Jungle because of all the plants. Vines ran along dividers between the cloth booths, and the wooden tables in the middle of the room were separated by small trees in pots and large fern-like bushes. The carpet was a deep brown, the walls oak, and the ceiling low. The lighting was spotlights, mostly aimed at the plants. The place always felt warm, almost cozy, and it was one of her favorite places on the base. She studied the large group, wondering if there was anyone there she knew. And that thought reminded her that besides Hank, she had no other friends here on the base who would be mad at her if she didn't say hello real soon. She already left a message for Jerry, her and her husband's best friend. She hadn't heard back from him yet, which wasn't like him. Maybe she would give him a quick call while waiting for Hank to get off duty and have him join her and Hank for dinner. She was sure Hank wouldn't mind. He could have her alone later in the evening, all he wanted. "Jonathan," she said, waving her drink at the tall, slim bartender who stood talking with 3 men in white lab coats near the end of the bar. He wore tight black slacks and an open-necked shirt, and was, without a doubt, the best-looking bartender she had ever seen. He smiled and motioned that he would be right there. She took a long, slow drink, and almost before she had the glass back on the bar, Jonathan had another in front of her. "That was fast," she said. He laughed softly, his voice deep and rich. "That's what they pay me for." "Jonathan," she said, "have you seen Jerry around lately? I left him a message right after I arrived, but I haven't heard back from him yet. That's not like him at all." The bright, happy look on Jonathan's face slipped into a frown, and his gaze dropped to something under the bar near his feet. He half choked on something, then said, "I guess you didn't hear." "Hear what?" It felt like the bottom of her stomach had dropped out. Jonathan hesitated, not looking at her. Then he glanced up and blurted, "Jerry was killed by an airlock accident 2 months ago." Hank's words about people disappearing, people getting killed for no reason, filled her mind like an echo chamber. But not Jerry. Jonathan had it wrong. She glanced up at the sad look on Jonathan's face. He reached out, but didn't touch her. "I'm sorry, Joyce." Her mind wouldn't let Jonathan's words in. That couldn't happen to Jerry. He'd never die in an airlock accident. Never. He was too damn good a spacer for that. She started to get angry and was about to yell at Jonathan for pulling such a nasty trick when she looked into his eyes and saw it was the truth. Jerry was dead. The realization overwhelmed her, and she fought to keep control. She felt dizzy, and the room blurred. She must have been staring at her drink, not moving, because the next thing she knew, Jonathan had a hand on hers and was squeezing it. "I thought you would have heard." She shook her head slowly, fighting to keep the tears from her eyes. God damn it all to hell. Not Jerry. Jerry was always there, always. For the kids' birthday parties, sometimes just to babysit for them. "Just a second," Jonathan said. "I'll get you a napkin." She remained motionless, the cold glass of crystal gripped tightly in her hand, fighting back any signs of tears, and remembering Jerry. Remembering his bright, smiling face, his quick sense of humor, his stupid, dirty jokes that still made her laugh. She remembered all the nights that she, Danny, and Jerry had drunk and laughed together, most of them ending with Jerry passed out on the couch. She remembered all the missions they had been on together during the invasion. Jerry had been there for her when Danny was killed, had helped her with his funeral, had hugged her and let her cry. And she had tried to be there for him at the same time. Danny, after all, had been his best friend. Together they had mourned for Danny, and Jerry had become almost a second father to the kids before he was shipped out here. He had been due back on Earth in 2 years to retire and just fish and work in his bike shop. Now he'd never get the chance. Jonathan came up from digging under the bar and quickly moved back in front of her. He slipped a wadded-up napkin into her free hand. "Here, use this." She nodded her thanks and dabbed her eyes with the napkin. As she did so, she noticed there was something hard in the napkin. She was about to stop and unwrap it when Jonathan put his hand over hers. She looked up into his dark, worried eyes. She could see concern in them for her, but also fear. Fear in his eyes and in the way he gripped her hand, forcing her to hold tightly whatever was inside. "I'm really sorry about Jerry," he said. "He was a good guy. He didn't deserve to die." She only nodded again, not trusting herself to say anything. "As a bartender, I'm pretty good at giving advice," he said, holding her gaze solid in his. You might want to go someplace private, like your ship, and really just let go. Cry all you want. It might do you some good." As he said the word ship, he squeezed her hand, and the message was clear. Again, Hank's words about the professor being able to see anything came flowing back to her, cutting through the anger and the grief, making her think cold, hard thoughts. "Thanks," she said, her voice sounding odd to her. "That's a good idea. I think I will." She fumbled around in her pockets for a moment with one hand, not sure what she was looking for. Finally, it dawned on her, and she said, "What do I owe you for the drinks?" Jonathan let go of her hand and waved. "Don't worry about it. Just take care of yourself." She caught the double meaning in that last sentence too. "Thanks," she said. She slid off the bar stool and headed towards the door, wiping away the tears and anger. She was real good at taking care of herself. If, somehow, the professor was responsible for Jerry's death, she would take care of that too. But first, she would see what Jonathan had given her. She couldn't imagine what it might be, but whatever it was, one thing had come through her anger and grief very clearly. He had been risking a great deal to do so. Could things on this station really be that bad? 20 minutes later, while sitting in the pilot's chair of her ship, she suddenly realized just how bad things on Charon base really were. The professor stood just inside the lab door, admiring the bustle of activity going on in the huge white room. 20 or so lab techs in white coats sat or stood at monitors, or moved quickly and with reason from one place to another, doing their jobs. He had some of the best scientists in all of humanity working with him, right here in this room. The room itself was almost a pure white and always scrubbed perfectly clean, yet to him it felt warm and friendly. Of all the places on the station, this was the area he was proudest of. He could spend days and nights in here without the problems of the station and the world outside, or corporation politics, bothering him. His duty in this room was to the greater good of humanity, and he knew that without a doubt. The door behind him slid silently open, and Grace escorted his visitor in. Cray was wearing tan slacks and a tan dress shirt, with the sleeves casually rolled up. The colors stood out in sharp contrast to the bright white lab coats of everyone else. The professor noted that Cray's gaze took in the room quickly, yet carefully, in a left-to-right scan. The professor had no doubt that if Cray was to turn around and leave immediately, he would still be able to tell someone exactly what the room looked like, and probably identify most of the machines in use. He was rumored to be good enough to even give descriptions of the 20 white-coated techs. Too bad there wasn't a way to test that theory. "Welcome, Mr. Cray," the professor said, while nodding to Grace that she was excused. "I thought you might like a little tour of my world." Cray smiled and nodded. "I'd enjoy it a great deal." The professor laughed softly. "Wonderful. Follow me." He led the way across the large, high-ceilinged white room. Today the professor noted a slight smell of alien blood, mixed with the cleaning solution smell. Not unusual, considering the work they did here. As they moved through the room, the professor nodded to different workers at computer consoles. There was never a time that the main stations in this room were left unattended. The professor led Cray over to a glass wall and stopped. "The main dissection tank," the professor said, indicating the clear, liquid-filled tank, itself the size of a good room. 3 human figures in what appeared to be deep space gear were carefully working over the remains of a large alien floating in the center. How do they avoid the acid blood? Cray asked, taking a step closer to the glass and intently watching the work. I adapted the gel that I understand you acquired for the company into an effective dissection medium. This has enabled me to extensively analyze and catalog the alien's morphology. Ingenious, Cray said. I agree, the professor said, and then laughed at his own half-joke. Although I discovered more about function and alien physiology than anyone else has before, it was at the molecular level that I made the most startling find. The one the corporation gave me a blank check to pursue. The DNA reflex? The professor nodded, not exactly happy that Cray had that level of knowledge before he arrived. Now he was starting to understand exactly why Cray was here. To Cray, with a nod of approval, the professor said, You've done your research, I see. Yes, tests show that an adult alien exhibits certain physical characteristics inherited from its host. We call it the DNA reflex. So, to change future generations of aliens, you give them different hosts. Kleist nodded, again impressed. That's exactly what we're doing here. Let me show you. The professor led the way down the hall and into a second large white room, 2 sides of which were walled with glass tanks. Behind the thick glass floated what looked to be human bodies. The professor noted that his guest stopped suddenly, almost in shock. Good. Cray hadn't known about this aspect of the work. The hairless, white bodies seemed to stand upright, naked, suspended in a clear fluid, bubbles drifting around them to the surface. Hoses ran from the backs of their necks, their heart areas, and their groins, into the wall below and in front of their feet. A control panel monitored each body's functions, and a white-coated technician was in charge of the monitoring stations, moving from one to the next, slowly and systematically, never stopping. Every one of the naked forms hanging in suspension had a face-hugger alien on his face. You like my dummies? The professor asked after a moment. Dummies? Cray asked, not taking his eyes off the human forms floating beyond the 2 glass walls. Dummies, the professor said, closely watching Cray's expression as he studied the bodies. That's what I call them. I cloned body tissue designed to mimic living matter to trick the alien implantation process. Yet the aliens have inspired many new commodities. Amazing, Cray said as he turned and looked at the professor. I had no idea cloning had gone so far. It is amazing, isn't it? He gave Cray a large smile, then indicated a door to the right. Let me show you something else. He led Mr. Cray out of the lab and into an area labeled Restricted in bright red letters. As they walked, their footsteps echoed off the smooth concrete walls. Imagine, Mr. Cray, the professor said. What might be the result if these creatures, these killing machines, could be bioengineered to become man's tool instead of his adversary? Consumer biologicals? Exactly, Kleist said, stopping in front of an airlock. A huge warning sign over it read, Alien Sector, do not enter. As he fumbled in his pocket, he went on. I have removed the aliens' innate hostility by splicing their DNA with that of more passive, less predatory creatures. I got the best results with sheep, llamas, and even some cattle. Of course, there were a few setbacks. There always are. The old adage about omelettes and breaking eggs, Cray said. Exactly, the professor said. All progress has its price. A necessary attitude, I think you'll agree. Logic and truth leave little room for moral posturing. I suppose, Cray said. So, from the way you sound, I can assume you have had some success. The professor smiled, pleased. He pulled a small instrument from his pocket, then turned to the wall in front of the airlock and started keying a command sequence into the control panel. I'll show you some of my progress. It is quite extraordinary, if I do say so myself. He finished keying his commands into the door panel, then turned to face Cray. However, I admit I have yet to produce the equivalent of a queen. Royal jelly alone doesn't prove to be enough. The airlock slid open with a clang. Hot, stinking air hit them both, and the professor took a deep breath, relishing the odor as if his mother were baking his favorite pie. Cray, on the other hand, choked and seemed on the verge of throwing up. Most humans hated that smell of aliens, but the professor loved it. That wonderful smell signified his work. He was making history. We're going in there, Cray said, looking into the dark, slime-covered corridor ahead, obviously not happy with the thought. The professor laughed softly. It's good to respect your fears, but don't let them rule you. Any good soldier should know that. And that's what we are, isn't it? Soldiers in the war against the aliens. I suppose you might call us that, Cray said as he took a shallow, shuddering breath and hesitantly followed the professor into the dimly lit corridor. Stay close to me, Kleist said. No matter what happens, make no sudden noises or movement. Don't worry, Cray said. The professor raised the small device he had fished out of the pocket of his lab coat. It looked like a toilet paper tube, only with a few buttons on top. Interesting device, this. He held it up for a moment, but Cray seemed more intent on watching the shadows and the slime-covered walls where aliens had formed stringy, slick shapes and dark, round pockets. I stumbled on its potential quite by accident, the professor went on. It somehow disrupts the impulses of what passes for the alien central nervous system. I've devised a larger version for securing wild specimens for study called a sound cannon by the Marines. This small one works more like a dog whistle. He pointed it down the hall and pulled the trigger. It seemed that nothing happened, but he could feel the device in his hand humming. A slight rustling started in the dark shadows down the corridor, like a den of snakes being disturbed on a hot summer day. Down there, Cray said, his voice a loud, insistent whisper. Keep calm, the professor said. They're coming. He continued to hold the trigger down until the black shadows at the end of the hall separated and became clear alien forms. Then he clicked it off and put the tube in his pocket. The overpowering stench grew stronger, and Cray took a step back towards the open airlock. The professor moved forward. Come on, the professor said, talking to the forms in front of him, forgetting Cray and the open door behind him. "Don't be scared. It's only me." Cray had backed step by step to the open door and stood watching, his mouth open in shock. Two small aliens separated from the shadows and moved toward the professor. "Come to Daddy," the professor said. Both aliens crawled on the floor in front of Kleist, like slaves in front of a master, until the professor finally reached down and stroked the hard shells on the back of their heads. "There, my good children," the professor said softly, over and over. "There, my good children."